Hi, I'm Marcus Fayers, founder and editor-in-chief of Dezeen, and I'm broadcasting live from Dezeen's brand new studio space in London. Today we've teamed up with workplace specialist BDG Architecture Design to discuss how to build better, more adaptable workplaces. I'm joined by Colin Macgadie, BDG's Chief Creative Officer. Hi Colin.
Hi Marcus, nice to meet you.
So to start off with, tell us a little bit about yourself and the work that you do at BDG.
So I'm Chief Creative Officer, as you mentioned. So I joined BDG almost 10 years ago as a creative director, and now sort of lead the business, if you like, with Jill Parker, who's our chief exec. So if we're a creative studio and a creative business, she's very much the business lead, and I'm the creative lead and responsible for the output across our studios, which are London, New York, Sao Paulo, and Shanghai.
And we're here particularly to talk about workplace design. How much of what you do is workplace design?
It's 99.9%. I mean, it really is. And I think it's when I joined BDG, they had a long running sort of, heritage in being sort of, definitely sort of consultants and sort of brief definers and really getting under the skin of brands and businesses to help them, understand how they could better occupy space and better set themselves up for the future. And I brought the kind of design edge to the business and bolted those two things together.
And we're going to talk about a concept called People First, Future Ready. What does that mean exactly in the context of workplace design?
I think for me it's and obviously what's happening and what has been happening for the last 18 months with the global pandemic and the impact that's had on how we work in general, not just workplace, but how we're all working and how that differs no matter where you are, region to region, business to business, person to person. There's no sort of fixed size now that fits all. I don't think there ever was, but certainly it's become more varied. There's a danger, of course, with what we're going through, that the businesses and organisations get reactionary to the change that's happening, and from minute to minute, day to day, week to week, as we know, the situation moves and is constantly in a permanent state of change. So we're, I guess, our understanding and our experience and our knowledge and our data that we've gathered for years and years around workplace, we're big believers that if you put your people first, and if you think about your purpose as an organisation, then that's really going to get more lasting, sort of long-lasting and meaningful change, in your business, and that's the path to take.
And we're going to talk a lot about the work you've been doing for WPP. Just briefly explain who WPP are and the portfolio of work that you're doing for them.
So most people might not know WPP, but we'll certainly know some of the brands that work for them, and some of these are long, sort of well-recognised heritage brands in the world of advertising, communications and media. So we've got people like Ogilvy, Wunderman Thompson, VMLY&R, Group M, who are a big media business. They employ about 100,000 people globally in over 40 countries, and they're the largest sort of media, communications and marketing services business.
And they're consolidating all of their London workforce on the Southbank, and that's the project you're going to talk about.
Yeah, so we're gonna share some of the project that was actually on Dezeen when it first finished a few years ago, about 5-6 years ago, which is Sea Containers House, which a lot of people in London will know, and certainly was a breakthrough project for us as a studio. And after that, yes, they're looking to relocate, which along the Southbank, about 10-minute walk from each other. So there'll be 3 buildings in total. And that will be approximately about 10,000 people in London in 3 buildings, all unique but complementary, and I think ultimately will be the sort of largest consolidation, if you like, of creative talent in London, I think, by the time it completes in a couple of years.
This sounds like a good point for you to start your presentation so we can see exactly what you've been talking about.
Yeah, brilliant. So, BDG, and as you mentioned, People First, Future Ready. And as I highlighted, I think sort of the idea of how if you focus on this approach to workplace design, it certainly creates more lasting and meaningful change. And I think what I should say about WPP, and we'll touch upon this a bit later in the presentation, is actually the creative transformation that they've been going through themselves as an organisation, not just the real estate and the workplace that they're delivering. So first of all, a little bit more about me. So I'm not an architect. One of the sort of common misconceptions with the role that I have in the business and the size of our business and the work that we do, and probably something that might be of interest to some of the sort of younger viewers that are listening now. When I graduated, and this sort of ages me a little bit, but back in the 90s, we were coming out of a previous recession here in the UK, and it was very evident that the people that graduated ahead of me were struggling to find work. So I had that difficult decision when I graduated to choose to carry on my studies or actually go into practice. So I went into practice for a small architectural studio in Islington. I had the full intent of going back and finishing my architectural studies, but then realised that as I progressed through my career that I was really enjoying what I was doing, and that idea of going back to being a student was becoming less and less of a desired outcome. So I guess my job really, and if I think about it now in the context of this comment from Angela Arendts, who's now a board member at WPP, I have the privilege, I guess, of running a studio that doesn't have my name above the door, and I think that has become a big part of the culture and the DNA for us at BDG. Jill Parker is, as I mentioned, runs a business. I run the creative output. Both of our names aren't there. We're probably third generation leadership in terms of the studio, and it is a big aspect of how we how we employ people, how we talk to our clients, and how we run a studio in terms of our principles around design. And I'd say here, our projects belong to our clients. We don't have a house style. We don't have so that's a signature style that maybe the name, if our names are above the door, that typically would be present, particularly in our industry and in the architectural industry. I always believe that the best work's going to come from the best people and the best talent. We have a very varied workforce talent in our studio. Architects, designers, strategists, a lot of creative thinkers, and that's my role really. And my role really is to make sure that I bring that team together, bring those people together, give them the freedom, almost step back and let them do the best what they can, and provide them with a platform that allows them to express themselves, do their best work, and ultimately, if they're able to do that, then our clients get the best results. In terms of our clients, I always think that we work best with clients that are looking to transform and are looking to change. And obviously in the current climate, we've seen a significant increase in the amount of work we do, particularly around strategy. I think the engagement with end user occupiers globally has been sort of significant over the last 18 months. We've seen access to C-suite, interviews and discussions and the conversation around workplaces very much hit the boardroom in a way that it hadn't done probably in the previous 5 to 10 years. But we're not for everyone, and although I have stuck a picture of Canary Wharf on here, it's interesting because we are doing some work in Canary Wharf at the minute, but I think historically we weren't really a studio that would work well in that kind of financial corporate environment. We're very much known for our work with tech companies, creative businesses, media businesses, and particularly, around organizations that some of them you'll be familiar with here, very much purpose-driven, very much businesses that are looking for innovation, and long-lasting solutions. A lot of our clients, the world of workplace is a funny world where people can sign up to space for 5, 8, 10 years. Actually, a lot of our clients are looking for much broader, long-lasting solutions, and they're signing long-term leases and looking at significant sort of regeneration projects. And we've very much found a niche for ourselves in that market. Look, with all of these, I always say to clients, if you're genuinely looking to do something innovative, if you're genuinely looking to make something that is long-lasting and is a solution that will stand the test of time, then being comfortable with being uncomfortable is something that you have to get familiar with. If it's genuinely new, then you're not going to be sort of sitting there comfortably thinking this is something that's right for us. You really got to push that envelope, and it's something we talk to clients very early on in the project. And of course, in the current climate, as I mentioned, that idea of permanent disruption, permanent change, that thought around, particularly around sort of real estate professionals, around chief exec, certainly chief people officers. We spend more time with chief people officers now than maybe we have done historically. This idea that we're permanently going to be in this state of change and disruption is something that means that conversation around being comfortable, being uncomfortable has become more and more relevant in the past few months. And then finally, I think evidence-based design is something that we've spoken about for a number of years. Evidence-based design thinking, I've pulled that in because we're spending more and more time with people and comms and change management. As much as we are in changing the built environment, we're helping organizations change the way they structure themselves, the way they communicate with the staff about work and the workplace in sort of broader context of work as a whole. And we've spent some time in the last 18 months with the Institute for the Future out of California and out of Zurich. And they do this interesting sort of forward forecast where they look 10 years into the future, but using a reference to 50 years in the past. And I think the way we're beginning to see some of the value of the work that BDG's done historically is our database and our evidence that stretches back to the beginnings of whether you want to call it agile working or activity-based working or the new word hybrid, which I don't particularly like. But we have so much evidence around organizations and businesses that have tried this before. None of it's new, I would like to say. Home working isn't a new concept. It's been around for a while, and what we're seeing is a much more drastic pace of change than we ever have before. So you mentioned sea containers, Marcus, and I think this, as I mentioned, this featured on Dezeen when it first launched. I've deliberately sort of framed this in that view of looking back and seeing how this project has helped us sort of drive change for the future at WPP. Sea containers is on the River Thames. It's the biggest commercial office frontage on the river. I moved people out of this building. It was a horrible building before it was redeveloped. And Paul O'Donnell, who's the chairman and chief executive at Ogilvy in EMEA, who's pictured there on the left, was aware that as they were moving their office in London, that it was going to be a once-in-a-lifetime project. This was a business that had been in their previous location for 20 years that was going to be signing a 25-year lease. So this is a significant opportunity for them to really implement some change. And Paul went to the market, went to about 12 different architectural practices. We were shortlisted to 3. And at this moment, I guess, in the journey, I guess the principle around that sort of egoless approach to our studio and how we operate in terms of the industry, I very much took a risk with how we approached the project. So I reached out to Matheson Whiteley, who are, at the time were literally just the two-man band that had formed. Donald Matheson and Jason Whiteley met Herzog and de Moran. They had both worked on sort of large cultural projects or art galleries, had no real experience in the world of workplace design, which is what we were bringing to the table. But I think there was this concept around this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for a brand like Ogilvy, the scale of the project that they were taking on, and their desire to do something genuinely different. So, I had to turn up to the presentation with Jason and Donald, and the first aspect of the first agenda item was relevant experience, and I had to stand there and say, well, we don't have any. We've never worked together before. And that, again, if I come back to that, be comfortable with being uncomfortable, we were there to challenge them. Their brief was asking for innovation. My view was that this was a structure that would drive that innovative thinking. And of course, their experience, I'm being flippant about their experience, it was relevant. Sea containers, when we took control of sea containers, we took it at Shell and Core. So this is one of the spaces pre-fit out. We had big, large floor-to-ceiling heights on the ground floor, overlooking the river. Probably more akin to some of the sort of gallery-esque spaces that Donald and Jason were familiar with designing. And then we had the challenging upper floors of the building, which were very, very low ceiling heights. That's me. I'm 6 foot standing in the building. There's no raised floor in there yet. There's no ceiling in there yet. And you can see how constricted those floors were. So we had some significant challenges that we felt that a unique and fresh approach to the project would help us resolve. And the outcome was fantastic. This is, conjoining 2 of the lower floors in the building with smaller openings. You can see the high floored ceiling heights allowed us to create smaller structural interventions on those floors that still gave you the visibility across the floor plates that you needed. Those constricted upper floors, we cut significantly larger chunks of space out of those and created double height, triple height, height and a half spaces, real terraced effect, a slow meandering sort of walk through that space that gave everybody views of the river and allowed them to engage with the river as they entered onto the floor. And then projects and spaces now that I guess, sort of sit almost independent of the design we did for Ogilvy. We have the upper 2 floors, which are a successful event space in their own right, which not only do the businesses inside and Ogilvy and WPP use, but actually are used by external clients and guests to the space as well. And this is a 200-person amphitheatre that overlooks the river, and it was a real sort of difficult aspect of the build to persuade the client to go ahead with, but it has had such a significant impact on how they get people together. And for me, really, it's when people get together in the buildings that these projects become successful, and the relaxed, sort of open, collaborative nature of these spaces that sit inside sea containers really sort of help fulfill that aspect of the brief around enhancing face-to-face collaboration. Ogilvy are a big advertising agency. Creativity is key to how they deliver their product to their clients, and actually having these spaces where they can informally get together is incredibly important. Spaces where you can work on your own, and then the large spaces is the amphitheatre that we mentioned, where you can get groups together and celebrate what you're doing. And also my first project where we had to design for dogs. everyone loves a dog. So it was a hugely successful project. Lots of publications, won lots of awards, and very, very quickly WPP picked up on the innovation that sat behind it. We had a significant amount of projects that came up immediately afterwards that were very similar in scale and very similar in nature. We'd taken one of the worst end-of-life commercial buildings in London that had previously been designed as a hotel, and suddenly we were looking at, redundant garages, telephone exchanges, other end-of-life office buildings. This one in Amsterdam, when it was completed in the 70s, was the biggest commercial office building in Europe. An old ceramics factory in Milan, and driving the same levels of innovation through these projects as we had done at Sea Containers. Looking at the amount of space that you dedicated to traditional working versus the amount of space that you dedicated towards more collaborative, more alternative ways of working, but also just looking at the architecture and saying, well, let's open these buildings up to the city, let's make them more open, let's make them more transparent, let's make a showcase of what's happening inside these buildings. And here in Amsterdam, there's a huge sort of reception area that, even for some of the larger buildings here in London that you see going up around Liverpool Street or in the city where they have these huge sort of arrival experiences, this was very much tailored just towards WPP, and now in Milan this is launching at the end of this year. That was successful, and I think it's only fair to say that I've spoken about collaboration with partners and architects that we've worked with to help deliver innovation, but you can't do any of that without a good client as well. And so Max Holiday pictured here, projects have been incredibly successful, won lots of awards, lots of PR for the client, and Max, these projects that you find, old garages, old ceramic factories, old telephone exchanges, they're not on your usual shopping list as a corporate head of real estate looking for office space, and so a lot of credit has to go to Max for sort of digging in and finding these buildings that really represent the brands incredibly well. So at the same time we were delivering transformation for the real estate portfolio, there was a significant change happening at WPP. So during that period of projects, there was a change in leadership at the top. So Mark Reed took over as global chief exec and began to look at how he could reposition WPP and transform the business that had been run previously, by the same chief exec and founder for almost 30 years or just over 30 years. And really started to look at WPP being less of a holding company and more of a company for creative transformation, and setting a tone that spoke about how he wanted the business to be represented outside of his industry and the industry in general. And what makes this incredibly sort of powerful at this moment in time, of course, is when you have an organization that's gone through a significant transformation itself, suddenly the real estate program can become a way of being a tangible expression of what that transformation looks like. And actually allowed us to look at how we would engage with WPP, engage with the end users, and actually integrate change at the very, very commencement of these projects. So they became less projects for design and more projects for change, in the way that for the professional team we would work to the various, industry standards around REBA stage delivery and whether you're doing concept design or developed design or technical design. But actually that sat in the background, and we talked to the clients about the topics and the pressure points that they were experiencing. And so we completely reframed the way we engage with the client. And so ultimately, design became a tool for change, which was a big learning curve for us as a studio, and allowed us to grow our capabilities in terms of, as I mentioned at the beginning, sort of full spectrum thinking around workplace. It was also an opportunity to redefine work at that point for what WPP wanted to be, improve the way that we utilize tech in the workspace. There was a concept around Sea Containers that when you walked into the building and started a video call, you should be able to go anywhere in the building and just retain that video call. And I'd say some of that was successful, some of it wasn't, but this moment in time to transform and change the way we work meant we could implement better technology, things that we see normally in a developer landlord market, where they're talking about, workplace apps that allow people to connect virtually with the buildings as well as physically. WPP are developing that in-house and deploying that at the same time they're deploying their campus programs. So suddenly we had this sort of, full spectrum way of looking at things. And I want to put this particular slide in, as this was a slide we produced back in 2018, 2019 when Mark first took over and we were building up this campus program. And really, it looked at the sort of 100-year history of the workplace. This is a sort of final slide of a longer workshop, and sort of charting the importance of or the influence of different aspects of in briefing a design team or professional team in delivering a workspace. So we got 100 years ago, it was the view of the business was the most important, and nobody ever spoke to the individual worker on the equivalent of the factory floor, essentially. But as time has progressed, obviously, as we know now, the influence of the individual on the workspace has become more and more important and more relevant to delivering a successful space. And then in the middle, there's a sort of the wavy line of the varying influence of team or collaboration, team working across the history of the workspace. And I think for us as a studio and for WPP as a client, and we talked to a lot of our clients about this, is that if you have the right space for the individual that is responsive to the demands of team, where the leadership in the business are empowering the people to use that space to the best of their ability to get the best out of them, then for us ultimately that's a healthy working environment. So it improves the well-being, and has been a well-being, particularly mental well-being, in the last sort of 12-18 months has become a key issue for the workforce. And ultimately their membership, I guess, is the influence of co-working space on the world of work, but that sense of belonging maybe rather than membership. Suddenly, if you get all these things and working together, you have a strong foundation for how you can deliver a workspace that's relevant to you as a business, relevant to you as a culture. And I think what I would say here is, of course, I'm not mentioning any of the jargon that typically comes with workspace design. Now, this isn't saying it's got to be agile. It's not saying it's got to be open plan. It's not saying it's got to be hybrid. Those things differ depending on who you speak to, where you speak to them, and what you want out of your business. And I think that's a key message here, is trying to avoid those traps, I guess, if you like, of just sort of marketing speak and I guess workspace jargon. So if that was the past and we suddenly had this framework for springboarding into the future, you mentioned, of course, that we have, our WPP will have 3 buildings along the river on the Southbank. So Sea Containers we've skipped through briefly, and Rose Court launches later this year, and we're also redeveloping the former Financial Times HQ just up there on Southwark Bridge Road, which will be finishing in 2023. So these are all 10, 15-minute maybe walk from each other, all along, I guess, conveniently, what is known as a creative mile as well down there on the South Bank. So I think it's a very sort of smart fit for WPP. It's not an intentional strategic real estate move. These were just buildings that ultimately became available that tied in with what we were trying to achieve. And as I mentioned, this is a sort of exclusive look at Rose Court in London. So 2018, this was the previous building. You'll be glad to know, not the redesign. So it was an end-of-life commercial building built in the early 90s. I think the health and safety executive were in here at one point, so it hasn't got an incredibly creative background. And when we took it over, it was as I mentioned, end of life, terrible energy rating, it needed substantial overhaul. And as we stripped out, we began to see some of the fabric of the building, which I've got here. We have generous footplates. We have good floored ceiling heights, nice dual aspect. And a building that has certainly at its fabric, the bones of an excellent workspace. And this is the CGI of the redeveloped proposal. So there's an element of extending the building. We've added some massing to it, completely redoing the facade so that we've got better acoustic provision from the street outside. We've got better, obviously, energy performance from the facade in terms of the building as a whole. We've got solar on the roof. We've got green roofs, and you'll see the circular sunken terrace on the top of the building, which is a bit of a feature, is because actually in the basement of this building is the Rose Playhouse, which is another original, bit like the Globe Theatre, I guess, an original Shakespearean theatre, which you can actually go and visit separate from our demise. But of course, everything we added to the building had to make sure it didn't impact on the retention of that space for historical purposes. It's basically a listed monument. Here's the view from Southwark Bridge Road, looking south. So the building has sort of, historically was, I think, probably part of a broader redevelopment that didn't happen moving further into the borough. So we've been able to tie the site now in with the massing of the buildings in Southwark Bridge Road. This is the view looking north towards the city. So very much playing upon the brick that's prevalent in Southwark as well, important aspect of the planning, and providing sort of WPP with spaces that won't only be accessible by the people, the brands and the businesses that will be present in the building, but also anyone who works for WPP. And I think this becomes an interesting part of the future model, which at the minute the hybrid is very much about, am I at home, am I in the office? Actually, what if you can come in and be in several offices and suddenly choose, a broader landscape of spaces that are more relevant for you to do the work you want to do and meet the people you want to meet. We have bars, restaurants, terraces, lots of space that isn't just about work in the traditional sense, but also work in the creative sense as well. And the building's on site now, so anyone who's in London who's walking past Southwark Bridge Road will realise that these have moved on a little bit further than before, but we have the sunken terrace with the cast sweeping stair, which brings you to the top of the building where you're overlooking the city, so fantastic views. Even though you're one step back from the river in this building, it's got enviable views across the city. And then finally, on the London story, this is the former FT building, which, as I mentioned, is sort of ongoing and happening now. Some of you might be familiar with this. It's been an iconic building, I think, on the Southbank for a number of years. This building is currently in planning. Again, we collaborated on this. This is a project we've been working in collaboration with Squire and Partners. Again, another great practice that I think, again, share our principles and sort of, leaving your ego at the door and just being genuinely collaborative and looking for the solution that best works for the client. They just completed or just got approval for a building just along the street from here on Park Street on the Southbank. And obviously their expertise and their knowledge in sort of navigating some of the complex issues we were having around an island site and opening up an island site to the river was a sort of valuable experience to bring to the table. And for the first time when this building launches, we will be able to walk between the archways that go under Southwark Bridge Road and the building. That's long been locked off from public. On the west side and on the east side, we're creating some gardens as well. So activate the courtyard space between our building and the neighbouring building. So it's going to be, I think, an important and a successful sort of addition to the Southbank when you're walking along that part of the river between the Globe, Tate Modern, and further on. So, it takes us to the end of what will be an 8-year journey where each building is learnt from the other and as I said, complementary, unique. Certainly projects that will sort of open up the conversation around workspace. By the time they finish, there'll actually be some affordable workspace in these buildings as well. So WPP are creating some affordable workspace for people who work in Southwark and live in Southwark. And I think part of that WPP ambition to be more than just advertising, media, communications, and to genuinely believe in the transformation that they're providing for their clients is to help transform not just the spaces, but the communities in which their buildings are present. And then it's something that continues. We've taken this approach to repurposing old buildings to the US. So our New York team are working on projects in Detroit, which is a former 1920s refrigeration warehouse, and looking one step further into product developments. How could we create an installation that would light the spaces for our people to work effectively in terms of task lighting, but actually provide programmable lighting that would be warmer and less kind of clinical in terms of workspace, but also then provide acoustic attenuation as well. So in this big warehouse, we've got, I think, almost 90 of these light fittings across the open plan workspace to bring together various issues that you typically experience in, I guess, badly designed workspaces. And Jorge, our creative director in New York, has been sort of instrumental in collaborating on this. He's ex-Zaha Hadid and ex-Thomas Heatherwick, so he's brought to our team a lot of creative thinking and is running the New York design studio from there. And then finally, I dropped this into the last minute, Marcus, because this was on your Dezeen Daily this morning with the Minecraft library that's gone out, and it's interesting to see that Minecraft is becoming a tool for communication, and it's something that actually is being led very much by the WPP IT and tech team, and one of the agencies, VML Y&R at WPP, is building this Minecraft world of all the campuses next to each other, avenue by avenue, street by street, all at scale, all fully realized, so it doesn't matter which campus you're working in globally, you can visit any of the campuses inside Minecraft and see what's available to you. So it's I thought topical given your daily issue this morning. And that's the end of the presentation.
Great. Well, had all these questions to ask you about the offices you've designed on the Southbank, but you throw me with the Minecraft, so I have to ask you about that first. So what exactly they're building the campus in Minecraft so that employees can go in and Is that kind of a metaverse thing so that they can cohabit the real world and the virtual world? How does that work?
It is, yeah. I mean, I've joined the sort of task force, if you like, with helping the teams get access to the architectural information we have on the buildings. But yes, they've built Detroit. Detroit comes full with the workflows and the event spaces that they have in there. They're even talking about hosting events inside Minecraft. So like you say, you know, not just a way of exploring the campuses, but actually experiencing them as well in a virtual sense. And so early stages, but we're now beginning to, you know, give them access to the CAD plans and the information around sea containers and the other buildings I mentioned, so that you'll be able to go almost street from street. You'll be going sort of to different parts of the world. So it should be quite an exciting sort of experience.
Oh, so all the different international locations will be in the same vicinity within Minecraft.
Yeah. But all relevant, you know, all the right scale to each other, so you'll be able to see how they all play out. So yeah, fascinating program. So there's a team that's been brought together inside WPP of, you know, tech experts and Minecraft super builders that are all bringing this stuff together. So yeah, it's going to be fascinating to see it play out.
And is that just for fun, or are there real productivity or community building purposes to that?
I think all of the above, and I think at this point it's becoming an interesting sort of discussion exactly around that. So you could do it, I think, in the way that Microsoft themselves did it on one of their campus buildings. I think maybe in Seattle when I was reading about it, they used it as a way of communicating for people who were going to be moving to the building what they were going to be getting there. And I think that was almost as far as it went. And you know, WPP would like to push that further. So what else can we do with this? How can we get different people helping us build it? How can we, you know, not even just people inside the business, but maybe external creative people helping to build it? And then how can we launch things in it? How can we run events in it? How can we use it as just more than just a communication tool? So it's going to be exciting to see how they pull it off.
And back to the real world work that you've done. Of course, as you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, the pandemic has really made everyone think at hyperspeed about changes to the office. Yeah. But with the WPP office in Sea Containers House, how has that impacted their working time, and how are they enticing people back to the office, if indeed they are? And also your own office is in the same building, so the same question for BDG's workplace.
So look, it's interesting, isn't it? I think that everyone, we looked at 3 stages of the pandemic actually when we were advising all of our clients. You know, the short term is very much when you had no control over what was happening. You know, you're following government advice and sort of the World Health Organization. We were all working from home, so it was what it was, and it varied in time scales globally, but certainly you weren't in control of it. We then looked at advising clients on the midterm, so there was going to be that period, and it's a period we're actually still in now, really, which is where you'd have some people back in the office and some people still working remotely, whether that's because they're shielding or whether they're vulnerable or whether they're uncomfortable with coming in. And that world still exists. And I know we've had restrictions here, but there's different parts of the world, you know, whether it's Australia, whether it's North America, where we're working now, where very much they're in that mid sort of term. And then the final bit is the look to the future. So, you know, in Sea Containers at the minute, in that midterm, we're following government advice. You'll see that there's, and I think, you know, Mark himself at the half-year results a few weeks ago when he was talking about, you know, WPP to the investors, was giving out figures of how the percentage of people in buildings is changing. I think maybe it was 20% in the UK, maybe it was 10% in the US, and much higher in some of the Asian markets. And that will happen for a while. And I think the desire is to entice people back into the office. I don't think you can do what a lot of our clients do, which is creative output, unless you are, you know, physically present with each other, particularly now. I think technology will make leaps and bounds in this. I've no doubt about that. And I know from our own experience of running our own studio and having to continue workshops with clients, you know, the online collaborative whiteboards and mural boards that we use have been fantastic, but they don't quite yet replace that sort of physically present sort of collaboration. So they will entice people back in. They'll try and entice people back in. I think performance will be a big driver of that. You know, it's not just about, you know, the design of the space and not just about coming back to see colleagues. I think coming back to see colleagues will be important, but performance as well. I know that if I'm at home, you know, my kids are at home and they're running around in the background, there's lots and lots of noise. I know my acoustics aren't particularly great at home. My broadband dropped out. I sat through a presentation to Sydney, a 2-hour presentation and workshop. I'm 45 minutes in and there's a thunderstorm outside and I lose the power to my house and the internet connection. So what do I do there? There's no resilience in some of our spaces at home. So actually there'll be a big emphasis on performance, making sure we get those things right, get the infrastructure right, get the tech right, get the acoustics right, get the quality of the spaces right from a performance perspective. I think when people realize that that's what they're going to be coming back to, even in the summer, things like air conditioning, right? So you're not sat at home in a hot environment. Those are going to be the big drivers for getting people back in.
I gave a 45-minute lecture to a conference in Kiev from our office during the pandemic. And at the end of it, they said, we weren't able to see it. I didn't realise until it was finished. You talked about how design can be a tool for change in office environment with reference to the Sea Containers project, but can you give me some specific examples of how the organisation used the design of the workplace to help trigger change, organisational change, or work practices change, or whatever? Yeah,
so if I go back, let's say we go back 10 years, because I've been working, with WPP for a long time. So I go back 10 years and you look at the metrics of how they were fitting their spaces out. So, the amount of space that was dedicated to a traditional desk space, let's say, whether that was open plan or in an office, but those types of spaces, versus the spaces for collaboration, particularly informal collaboration. You don't get genuine creativity and innovation by scheduling in a diary. Right, so like what you're doing on Wednesday at 3:00. Oh, I've got my meeting for innovation. That doesn't happen. So you need those informal spaces to make those sort of collaborations, really successful. They were tiny. I mean, really tiny, like 5% of the workspace. And then you'd have your formal sort of conference and meeting rooms, because it was always about the big pitch. Advertising. Anyone who watches Mad Men or sees sort of some of those old examples, those sort of big pitch moments are still super relevant. But that was all it was. And what we managed to do through, in particular, the Sea Containers project, which was that catalyst for the broader success of the campus, is we spent 9 months with the business looking at what they were doing. And we would witness people sat in corridors, having phone calls with people and working on like coffee tables on stools, because they needed to get away from the space to think, away from the desk space to have a think. They didn't want to book a room. There weren't any rooms because they didn't have enough. And you're observing these strange bits of behavior, which absolutely backed up, Paul O'Donnell as the chief exec, his ambition for, enhanced, particularly small groups of people getting together for quick collaboration. And so with all that time we spent with them and sort of backing up his kind of vision with the evidence of what we were seeing people attempting to do in an environment that wasn't fit for purpose, we ramped that up. So we said, right, we think you should do this. And essentially we took, what was 230,000 square foot, and we said, well, only 50% of that is going to be traditional workspace, and the rest of it is going to be this landscape and this playground for small groups, big groups, private, semi-private, formal, informal, client-facing, internal-facing, event spaces, social spaces, different types of engagement that could take place across this whole kind of spectrum of what we saw the future of work would be for them and what his vision for the future of work would be. And that was the biggest significant shift on that project. If you take away how we learned to engage with clients better and that whole kind of packaging up change management, the big shift was just that leap of faith in terms of how you would program that space, the primary program for the space that would deliver that significant sort of shift in behavior. And suddenly when people have that space at their, fingertips, you then we did post-occupancy evaluation, and you sit in the building, you watch how they're hacking it and how they're using it and how they're beginning to really sort of get a grip of it and use it to the best of their sort of abilities and get their best work out of it. It was fascinating, and that's probably the single significant shift.
And then, but how did that benefit WPP then? What kind of beneficial change did that bring? On the sort of post-occupancy evaluation, you'd see we'd measure things like interruption. So if you look at, not our science, but you look at science around people in the workplace, you get big complaints around open plan working, right? So I'm sat there working and get distraction. Well, actually by shifting that metric and bringing into play all this collaborative space, what was happening was people were seeing it was available. You remember all those cutouts we made in the building. You could see if there was a space available to you. And you get up and you go use it for that type of work, which meant distraction and interruption dropped in the open plan spaces. Now, typically people say, well, open plan's not great for concentration. We were able to provide evidence that it was. And of course, if you're there and you're able to concentrate without distraction or interruption, you're more productive. And the more productive you are, it's the golden sort of, I guess the aspect that everybody wants to get in a project is how do I make my people more productive? There was a metric that was maybe pointing towards that.
And then on the face-to-face collaboration, which for a business like WPP is key to creativity, suddenly we were enhancing that. So we were measuring it, movement and face-to-face interaction was suddenly getting bigger and bigger and bigger in these spaces. So you're balancing those two things. Suddenly I'm opening up communication, I'm opening up collaboration, which is great for ideas. And when I am in my traditional space, I'm dropping distraction and I'm more productive. And I think those things we continue to measure as we go forward.
You mentioned right at the start how some people have kind of overreacted to COVID and kind of knee-jerk changing spaces and basically just making too big a deal of it. What do you mean by that, and what is the approach that is better than that?
I think I have a bugbear with, which is strange given the sector I work in, but a bugbear with the sort of world of workplace furniture. So you'll always get, here's a hybrid, coffee table. What does that mean? And it's just a way of, I guess, businesses trying to adapt quickly and trying to get to market quickly. And, we've all got to run businesses. I get everyone has to, keep a job and want to be successful. But I think that's the danger of seeing with clients is, you're suddenly I'm speaking to a client for the first time, a new client during the pandemic, and talking to them about the research we've done and the engagement we've had and what we're finding. And of course, they're throwing things back at you, which are just, simple execution of ideas that, people think will happen in the future. And the classic example being the stand-up, one person sort of phone booth. There's probably thousands and thousands of those being made and deployed globally at the minute. But are they going to be a permanent aspect of the workplace future? Maybe, to the same degree as we're deploying them now, maybe not, and I think we're just going to be careful around some of those sort of, aspects of the industry or the sector that sort of push people in a very simple way to a sort of solution that maybe isn't permanent. So for us, it really is about, we're saying, well, what is the change you want to be? Where do you, and again, so looking not just to the next year or 2 years, there's executional sort of thinking at the minute, which is how do I just bring my people back into the office safely and get that working. That's fine. But then there's a long-term view, the strategic view, and the strategic thinking is where we're trying to push our clients. We're trying to get them into that strategic mindset so they can think much broader into the future and think less about those immediate responses.
I've got one more question for you. We're then going to go to audience questions because I can see there's a few. But all of the 3 London buildings, and in fact also Madrid and Detroit and the other projects, they all reuse existing structures. Is that to prevent carbon emissions because you've got some embodied carbon that's already there, or to save money? What's the thinking behind using a pre-existing structure rather than starting again, knocking the whole thing down?
I think certainly I mentioned Max Holliday, who's the head of real estate for EMEA. Certainly his, criteria for a building is very much around that strategic reuse, I think, and sort of the power of regeneration. I think it plays very well into what WPP has become, and certainly WPP has its, targets in terms of carbon emissions, and it does help with that story. It helps with how we get our accreditation for our buildings in terms of whether it's BREEAM or LEED and so on. And also, I think if you look at in the context of who the client is and the types of spaces that best represent those clients, that client is typically a repurposed building that was never designed, whether it was a telephone exchange or a warehouse. Those creative sort of spaces work really well with who the client is. It's certainly not cheaper, and I think and it's certainly not quicker. And then, as in your experience, it's taking on those projects and taking on those challenges comes with an inherent sort of risk around, the on time and on budget delivery of them. It's much easier to go away and lease a tower with, covered in glazing. So I think it's a strong aspect of the character and culture of the client, very much led by real estate, but relevant to the brand.
Okay, let's go to audience questions then. Ahmed Alderwood has asked, where do you draw inspiration from? Is it from the challenges within designing spaces, or is it drawn from surroundings and culture around the building?
Okay, that's an interesting question. So I think I mentioned at the top, I'm lucky in that I surround myself with a team of incredibly creative individuals. So I think a lot of that is around, making sure that we're constantly, inspiring each other, I guess. We have regular sort of studio get-togethers where we try and make sure that we're constantly aware of what everyone's doing, thinking, or stuff that they've seen. So I think there's an element of, you know, looking inward for inspiration, actually, as much as outwards. Certainly, surroundings and culture, in every project, you know, particularly when you're, you know, looking, for my role in terms of looking creatively at projects that are happening maybe in Detroit or Jakarta or Sydney or Melbourne, you know, I have to have a understanding of what is the local sort of regional culture and character of those spaces. We're not rolling out, you know, a fixed footprint that works, you know, no matter where you are. So there's a big part of our process, and our methodology is, you know, not just getting under the skin of the brand, but getting under the skin of the location as well, context.
Okay, next one. Supriya asks, how did you cut the concrete slab in sea containers? I guess you didn't do it yourself.
I didn't do it myself. So interestingly, so we worked with Arup, first of all. So Arup were our structural engineers on the project. It was complicated. Fire was complicated. We couldn't, you know, there's a hotel in the building. So actually being able to cut the openings and have such large fire compartments, but still make the building safe for not only the staff in WPP to evacuate, but the occupants of the hotel to evacuate as well, was incredibly difficult. There was facade retention, so there was a moment where the size of the openings we wanted to cut would meant that the facade would have fallen into the Thames. So there was lots of complicated structural alterations done in a sensitive way that I think when you look at it, you don't realise this, maybe the complexity that sits behind such a simple sort of architectural space. But I won't take all the credit for it. I think Arup were, you know, certainly a strong force to push that through, and a lot of energy to push that through.
But actually, practically, how did you actually cut them? I guess, what tool did you use?
Oh, it was a saw. So they were sawn, yeah. So you got that nice kind of clean edge on the waffle slab that was, you know, is a way of building that we don't typically see anymore, that is synonymous with that period of architecture. But yeah, so we cut through with a saw to get the clean expression.
Not a handsaw.
Not a handsaw, no.
Circular saw, probably. And finally, from Amber Ellis, do you see 3D modelling similar to Minecraft being a big part of illustrating your ideas to your clients? I'm actually going to add a bit to that. So, like, how are you using technology, and how will that change? You know, do you use things like VR walkthroughs, augmented reality? Do you use Minecraft to show clients your? And I suppose that particularly given the pandemic situation that we've had, when you can't have physical meetings, how do you get ideas across to clients? Yeah,
so as a studio, I think certainly in terms of the technology or the software we use, we're, you know, Revit is probably familiar for those in the industry that are watching. It's a software that we use for not just creating the environments we're designing fully in 3D virtually, but also for collaborating with external consultants and you know, having virtual models that everyone has access to. Is from when I graduated to now is a much removed sort of way of working. So inside that, we automatically have a 3D environment. So yes, VR has become part of what we use to help share our ideas. I'm quite keen to share quite early with clients. If you're going to make significant alterations to buildings, like cutting big openings and slabs, you want them to get an experience of what that looks like. Remotely, you can send things to people now on their iPhones and they can have a look. You can use the VR goggles. It's becoming sort of so incredibly easy to share sort of, you know, content that allows them to get more immersed in the design than it ever has been. I think on top of that, we've actually been able to take, I guess, the technical sort of virtual sort of worlds, is take them out of that and actually make them easier for clients to understand from a communications perspective. So we worked really hard during lockdown to say to ourselves, well, actually, there's so much change happening, and clients find it quite difficult to look at plans or, you know, to look at architectural content to understand what that's going to mean for them. We should have a way of illustrating this that makes it much, much easier for us to communicate, you know, what they're going to experience in the space. And typically that's the type of engagement they're going to have. So we'll take our data analysis, and if we have a client and we know how many people they're going to have in the building, on our illustrations there's that amount of people. And if we know how many people are going to be sat at desks, and how many people are going to be collaborating, and how many people are going to be moving around, how many people are going to be socializing in a tea point, we actively illustrate the data in a way that when they look at it, they can just really understand. It's almost like a Where's Wally, right? So they can look at it and see what's happening. And I think that's become incredibly powerful in terms of communication with clients going through the change we're going through now. And that's driven straight from the same software. So it's becoming an incredible time for both immersive and communicative, you know, sort of conversations with clients.
And do you personally use Minecraft?
I don't, but my 12-year-old son and my 7-year-old daughter do.
Yeah, likewise. Oh, we've got one more question just popped up. Let's squeeze this one in, shall we? From Azure. Do you have advice for young people entering architecture school?
I think it's tough. I really do think it's tough, and I don't think I'm going to be very sort of UK centric here at the minute. I don't think the government are doing a great job in terms of, how they're investing in sort of creativity for the future. We've seen recent sort of news articles around removing some of our more creative subjects from the curriculum. I think that's a big step backwards. I'm a big believer, and you'd think this given my job title, Chief Creative Officer, but I have kids and I look sort of to their future. I'm a big believer that we're going to enter the creative economy, and the pandemic sped this up. So if we look at the jobs that were lost to automation, the jobs that were lost to AI during the pandemic, when the restrictions are lifted and when we're all vaccinated and maybe the world feels healthier, do we think those jobs are coming back? Of course they're not. And what we've seen is that acceleration of a shift in workforce that was maybe 10 years away has come forward by 7 years. And that was always going to happen. But my view essentially was that, well, you have to supplement that with human sort of behavior and creative thinking. And the role of me as a chief creative officer in a design agency is fairly obvious, but I imagine that in the future, if you'll be able to be the chief creative officer at a financial institution or an insurance company or whoever it might be, they'll need that aspect of creativity in their C-suite, in their boardrooms, helping them navigate sort of the future and helping them make sure that they remain human. So I think there's a big challenge for people not just entering the architectural school, but entering any of the creative sort of sector, and making sure that the government and the world remains inclusive, that we remain investing in sort of the creative economy, particularly in the UK. It's one of our biggest export sort of economies as well. So I think if I had any advice, it would be, think about, is it architecture that you want to be in? Is it a more creative sector you want to be in? Advertising is creative. I spent a lot of time around advertising agencies, so I see what that's like. And I remember when I was a student, I didn't really know about advertising as a career when I was there. So I'd say, spend a bit of time understanding what it is about creativity that you like. Is it the architecture? Is it something more broader? In the arts and culture, and just make sure you've got the right path and have a think about where you want to be in the future.
Actually, I'd like to add something to Azur's question. I've been speaking to a few people lately who've been talking about how architecture will change, and a lot of people are saying that technology, AI, computer power will take away a lot of the kind of admin side of the job, because a lot of what architects do is admin, running projects, specifying materials. But the first 3 years of an architecture course are the fun bit where you get to design. So I would say go to architecture school, do those 3 years, and then hopefully by then technology will have caught up, and you maybe don't need to then do the following 4 years that are all.
I completely agree. I think architectural schools have got a big challenge ahead of them, haven't they? And sort of as technology plays a more important part in the delivery of these projects, and maybe reduces some of the risk and maybe reduces some of the complexity. How are the schools, adapting their training and their teaching and the skills that they're developing in the future of the industry? It's a massive moment, I think, for education in the creative sector in general.
That sounds like a good point to end on. Colin, thank you so much. Thanks very much to our audience, and thanks very much to BDG Architecture and Design for making this talk happen.